I think, you said the financial sector is doing quite well. In the email that I sent out, I had some statistics in there that, probably 20, 30 years ago, the financial sector was only about, it was less than 10% of the GDP. I've heard it was less than 8%, actually, I think. And it grew to be about 25% by the time everything blew up in 2007, 2008. And to me, finance is supposed to be the lubricant of the economy. It's not supposed to be the economy. And so, there's some serious problems there. And so I think we need to figure out, how to correct that. So a lot of that, Reagan changed a lot of the laws about compensating executives, and we slashed taxes on the top brackets greatly with no way to pay for it. And so one thought, which our guest speaker here is going to talk about, is maybe we should have a state bank. North Dakota, I guess, is the only state that has a state bank, right?
Today, the Samoan Islands also.
Is that right? Okay.
We're very, very close to
Right.
having one right now.
So, North Dakota started their state bank basically because, farmers were not being served well by Wall Street banks, and, they felt like they needed to try to do something locally to try to support their local constituencies. And so I think it's done quite well. I think, Ed will probably talk more about this. They returned, I think, about $1 billion to the state over the last, 20 years, something like that?
Last 20 years, about 550 million, almost over half a billion.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting idea, and Ed he's run for state rep twice. He's running on the Green Party for the Comptroller right now. And I think your main platform is we should start a state bank, right?
Well, in as much as a comptroller has a platform, I realize it's more of a clerical sort of position.
Okay.
I understand that. But I might suggest to whether the assembly, maybe representatives or senators, that they might think about a state bank
Okay.
to help the cash flows.
Right.
Yeah.
So come on up. Ed is a Wall Street consultant. He has a master's degree in computational finance. He has a PhD in physics. He has a very interesting and diverse background. And so I'll let him take it from there. Thanks a lot, Ed.
Thank you very much, Doug. So yeah, just to kick things off, Doug, is there any way I could connect up an HDMI adapter maybe to my computer? And now I'm going to want to control my computer a little bit because I've invited a couple of speakers to join us this evening. The only conditions under which they agreed to join us is if they were represented videographically. So I'm going to show you a couple of videos that tie in well and in fact really explain, almost articulate better than I ever could, public banking. I don't know if you can hear me or if it's yeah, the HDMI is on the inside.
The wire only goes so far.
Here.
So if we want to, let's try.
Perfect. Okay.
No signal.
There we go.
Okay. So I hope I don't block too much of what I intend you to see here. So you probably see my outline already for my presentation. So let me get started. Let me just kick off by first of all saying,
louder.
I guess if I talk closer to the microphone, that's going to help.
Yeah, the volume.
Okay. Perfect. Yep. So I'll start a slideshow here. Now, the fact of the matter is, this is actually an open office product that I'm using for this, so it's, as you can imagine, open source. And not that I don't like Microsoft, I think their products are great. Just if I could get something free that functions very similarly or to almost the same degree, why not? Why not try it? So making the case for state banking, that's me, your presenter. I'm presently a Green Party candidate for Connecticut State Comptroller. I have to admit, I was a Green Party candidate as well too, twice running for Senate for District 36, which included Greenwich, New Canaan, parts of Stanford. I guess I'm snake bitten at this point twice because I didn't quite win as a third-party Green Party member or candidate. But truth be told, there was a little bit of strategy involved. The only way that you would get on a ticket against a Republican incumbent would be to either be a Democrat, that the Democrats decided not to run, or to be a Green Party member, which is what I obviously opted for. Because money is, at least the face of it, or I'm sorry, the back of it, a greenback. So, public banking. First of all, what's its mission? The mission of the publicly owned bank is to serve the public interest, while the mission of the privately owned bank is to serve the interest of the shareholders and presumably deliver profits. Although back in 2008, you would have been hard-pressed to find profits on any of the bulge bracket firms on Wall Street. There was literally red ink flowing all over the streets of Manhattan. Profits of a publicly owned bank would be returned to the public with the benefit of increased public services, public goods, roads, buildings, highways, manufacturing facilities, factories, solar factories, be it what you will. What the community kind of comes to a consensus agrees should be done with that community and with money from that community. Conversely, again, privately owned banks increase taxpayers' costs by compounding interest. Let me give you a simple example. California, the Bay Bridge. They recently rebuilt their Bay Bridge, and the project was slated for about $6.5 billion originally. You know what it ended up costing? Double that. It ended up costing $13 billion. You know why it doubled? Because of the interest, the cost of money, and fees associated with it. Yeah, you could have built 2 Bay Bridges. Instead, they just built one. And God knows California needs all the bridges and highways it can get. So privately owned banks increase taxpayers' costs through the compounded interest. And again, that's the interest that's charged on the money that you're going to use from that bank. And the loss of other benefits would be derived if the publicly owned bank were leveraging public funds for local needs, such as the effects of projects, such as the effects such projects have on local communities in the economy. Kind of what I'm getting at here is, if you think about where your money, where your estate taxes, fees go, once they go out of your hands, once you write that check to the treasurer, Denise Napier, what does she do with it? She doesn't invest it in Connecticut. You know where she takes it? She takes that nice little Red Riding Hood basket of money and delivers it to Wall Street to do whatever the heck they want. The only thing we beg of them is that they return at least the principal that we gave them, the money we gave them, with the presumably interest. And for some of our accounts, like the short-term investment fund account, do you know what that interest is these days? It's a pittance.
Enough.
Is it?
Yes.
Is it really?
What I'm getting is enough in my bank.
I'll take Q&A later, but they get, on average, 0.18% on their short-term investment fund account. 0.1, less than a percent. Less than a percent. Now, if I told you, conversely, a public bank could deliver 1,000%, and I mean 10 times leverage, 10 times. So instead of bringing that $5.6 billion to Wall Street, keep it in the state of Connecticut in a bank, the Connecticut State Bank. And 1 year later, what are you going to have with $1 billion? Instead of $1.016 billion, you will have $10 billion. Through the use of fractional reserve banking, I'll talk a little bit about that, why that's so important and such a critical ingredient to a public state bank. And finally, employees of a publicly owned, whoops, jumped ahead a little bit, of a publicly owned bank are public servants. So they earn a civil service wage. Granted, the president of the bank, the board members of the bank could pay themselves a reasonably good wage. But do you think that wage should be 380 times the average earning wage earner for the average Fortune top 10 company? If you do, then you might be happy with the present banking system as it exists. If not, we can do better. And that's the simple answer. We can do better. And of course that's versus, and all these are juxtapositions of privately owned banks versus publicly owned banks. I know this cuts off here and I apologize. Versus the millions in salaries and bonuses to CEOs and presidents of privately owned banks. So, now here's what I'm going to do. I promised you I invited a couple of very interesting people. Ellen Brown I invited this evening. She's going to be here with us. I invited a young lady by the name of Victoria Grant. She's going to be here with us. If you don't know her, you'll want to know her, and you'll get to know her after the end of my presentation here. So I'm going to click on this. This is going to bring up a YouTube video. And why do I do this? Well, partly because the OEM, embedded OEM in Office, open source Office. This has sound as well. I hope
Just
to
put the microphone up to your computer if you have it.
Oh,
Or we can try to pick this up.
I would assume with HDMI. There we go.
Business development within their own states.
Okay.
And it's very important business to get into for the states because during
So
this
I'll
terrible
let
economic
Steve
recession
talk.
we're in, it's all about cut, cut, cut. And we need to think of creatively about new ways to grow our economy. And this seems to be a good way to do that.
How is this different than what the banks already do?
There's only one state in the country, the Bank of North Dakota, which has been involved in state banking since 1919, that has such an institution.
Mm-hmm.
And it's operated very successfully there as for almost a century. And in North Dakota, it's important to note that they have a very low unemployment rate and that they a budget which is one of the few state budgets which is in balance. So it's worked very effectively there for a century. And the tradition actually goes back to colonial times of state-owned banks, back to Pennsylvania. They had a state-owned bank, and it was championed by Benjamin Franklin, who attributed Pennsylvania's prosperity in the 18th century to the fact that Pennsylvania issued its own loans to create business development in that Commonwealth.
This is money that can be loaned to commercial banks that will then take that money
Current
and lend
system.
it at a
This is what
reasonable
Wall
interest
Street
rate
delivers.
to the citizens of the state to fund projects like infrastructure or...
It could be done for many different purposes, and it could be done in many different ways. The state bank could loan money
State bank
directly
system.
for
This could
infrastructure
be us.
projects, or in the case of North Dakota, often enters partnerships with other banks for large projects, or for emergency loans, or for, in some cases, student loans. It would all depend on the priorities of the state. Personally, I think that the main use of such a bank right now would be for infrastructure to promote the economic productivity of a given state, and also for small business loans for businesses that are cut off from private lending right now.
All right, and this is something that is a nonpartisan issue. This isn't something that we're advocating to benefit the bankers, because this money would produce future revenues that would then be paid back to the state.
Very good point, Gus. These bank loans made by the state bank will produce revenues from interest collected, even though the interest will be at a pretty reasonable rate compared to the private sector.
Right.
And that income from interest will go right into the state treasury.
So what is the relationship between the commercial banks that citizens can go up and interact with and get loans from to put their deposits into with a state-run bank?
Well, in the case of North Dakota, they didn't really go in big time into the savings accounts, the checking accounts. They see themselves as a catalyst for the private sector acting in partnership with other banks to make loans. State Bank could have its own savings accounts and checking accounts, but it seems to me that's a need that's already been met by the commercial banks. Where we really have the need for state finance banks is for projects that are so long-term that the private sector wouldn't find a sufficient short-term return for them to get into it.
How does it actually work?
The states, at any given time, have substantial amounts of money in what they call a rainy day fund. In the case of a state like California, that can be as much as $70 billion.
That's a significant amount of money.
Huge amount of money, but that state agencies need for their operating functions, that this Treasury Department may have from tax revenues that are waiting to be dispersed. So these funds are right now, they're just sitting there. Maybe the bank's getting a 1 or 2% return on it, and putting it into investments that in no way may benefit the state. They may be used for speculation in derivatives or any other purpose that's not contributing to the state's economy. So the idea is we use this bank, or the state would use these funds that are available as a reserve. Now the reserve doesn't actually get lent out. A reserve in a bank, whether it be the state-owned bank or the commercial bank, is simply used as a backstop for the new loans that are created by the state bank to stimulate growth. And that can be done under the fractional reserve system many times greater than the actual amount of reserves. So you could actually make loans that are multiples of the amount of reserves you have.
But the difference would be where commercial banks and say like the Federal Reserve, which is privately run, they use fractional reserve banking to benefit themselves and their shareholders, where a state-run bank would use fractional reserves to actually inject liquidity capital into the state economy.
That's right. It would be for the benefit of the state economy, not the benefit of investments or speculation elsewhere. Additionally, the state-owned bank would obviously not be paying huge bonuses to high-flying, risk-taking executives. The guys would be paid who work there would be paid reasonable salaries, and they wouldn't be charging exorbitant interest rates because the state could obviously set the interest rate at which it just chose to lend money.
Beside North Dakota, which already has this bank functioning, aren't there other states around the country that currently have bills pending to create a state-run bank?
That's right. There are 7 states that now are considering bills to either create a state bank or to study the feasibility of creating a state bank, including Michigan, Massachusetts, Illinois, Virginia, and Oregon. So it's a substantial movement, and behind it now, or helping to foster it, is a new organization called the Public Banking Institute, which is chaired by Ellen Brown, who wrote a book called Web of Debt, and she's one of the leading money experts in America, and she's decided to put her knowledge of money to work to create a new state banking movement.
So to summarize, a commercial bank will lend money out at a high interest rate and earn a profit on that, which benefits them as a corporation. But a state-run bank would be taking the interest rate, which is much more moderate, and then putting that money back into the state coffers, which they can create more public service projects or reduce taxes or do whatever else that would benefit the citizens of that state.
Exactly, Gus, and it's really a no-brainer. There's no reason not to do it. That money is sitting there in the state governments, earning minimal interest, and could be leveraged as a reserve for a new bank to benefit the state and its citizens.
Not only that, but the states are investing their money into banks in other states or in other locales that is not benefiting the state in any way, any shape or form.
The biggest form of investments now are derivatives, and they're doing nothing for your local state development.
Well, one of the problems that's hitting the economy right now is that we've seen a lot of the states and cities invest their money into funds that have been completely pilfered by the economic crisis right now, causing all the layoffs and budget cuts.
And as a state agency, this state bank will be subject to the scrutiny of the elected representatives, so there's going to be accountability.
Do you think that the opponents of the public banking might say that this is going to put the government in a position where they can choose the winners and losers in the economy?
I think there has to be a concern that you want the bank to be run on a very business-like basis, and I think that this banking community can be brought to understand that this will benefit them too. If the state economy is increased in prosperity because of investment in infrastructure, that's going to be a boost to businesses of all kinds. Thanks very much for listening to this YouTube edition of In Context. This is Ken McDermott Rowe.
And Gus Cantavero.
You can check out our website, incontextreport.com, on the web, and then make your comments on our blog. And you can tune in to us on WPKN 89.5 FM in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Our schedule is listed on the website.
And we're also streamed live at WPKN.org.
Thanks for listening.
So great. So, as a takeaway, wouldn't it be great to have your taxes reduced and have all liabilities that the state has, for example, over $120 billion from what I understand, latest count, in the unfunded pension liabilities alone in the state? How about the state's budgetary gap, which seems to be growing every year, but seems to be $1 billion plus every single year, and going out to the 2-3 years in the future. That's what the office of that's what the state government is presently predicting at this point. To get the benefit, so yep, okay, I think we're all set. So
I just turned the TV off.
okay, not a problem.
You ready to go to the slide?
Yeah, let's get that. There we go. So, in summary, if the benefit for private bank goes to its shareholders, and the benefit for the public bank goes to you, the Connetizen, and the state, in the case of the State Bank for Connecticut, where do you want to put your money? Yeah, wouldn't you want to put it right here? Why would you want to put it in Wall Street where it doesn't benefit you in terms of any infrastructure? Remember, that's what Gus and Ken originally, or at least through the first couple of minutes, came to the conclusion with the Bank of North Dakota as to where its sweet spot in the financial services industry was. Funny enough, there's a long sordid history with the Bank of North Dakota in terms of how it got started. For the first couple of years, it was very rocky going. No one would buy their bond. The bond essentially was the bond that would bring in that reserve capital to then begin the process, like priming the pump, to begin the process of the fractional reserve banking. So once they had those greenbacks in a vault, then they could lend out through fractional reserve banking. You know, you need 10% in the vault, and you can lend 10 times that equivalently, if you do the math, with continual compounding interest to different clients, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the fractional reserve banking system. You can only take advantage of that if you have money as reserve in the vault. At the very beginning, back in 1920, 1921, 22, there was a lot of political infighting in North Dakota. As a matter of fact, there were two parties that were very contentious. One kind of reminds you perhaps of the Republicans, the other perhaps the Democrats. So if you want, I'll point you to the video, but you should take the time. It's a 26-minute video. I'm not going to take you through all of it. I'll kind of cut to the chase. 10 minutes in, you get a real flavor for some of the infighting that went on. They were having trouble, believe it or not, selling their bonds that were backed by the farmland. Very fertile, very productive farmland. Most of the grain came from that particular, the Midwest, and that was considered part of the essential, and was sent back east, was shipped out to Chicago, was shipped out to New York, especially on the East Coast, for consumption, for purchase and consumption, basically. Very fertile land, and very independent farmers, very independent ranchers. But they were having trouble selling their bonds. Why? Because Wall Street basically put the word out on the street not to buy their bonds. It was Wall Street who was trying to chloroform the whole process. And to begin the process, you have to capitalize. That's the first step in capitalization, or to date has been considered the first step in capitalization. Perhaps there are other things that we can do, and I'll touch on those as far as capitalization. Actually, I presented to the General Assembly of Connecticut a full-fledged bill that would have instituted a Connecticut State Public Bank, A to Z, 21 odd pages. It's available for consumption. I believe I put it out there for publicly if you wanted to download it, read it. But the point is, the first step in establishing the bank beyond the legislation and the law, the first technical step is to get money in a reserve. To do that, there are probably 7 different methods of capitalization. The knee-jerk method is to float a bond onto the marketplace, onto Wall Street. Anyways, getting back to, so that's one of 7 different capitalizations that I outlined. Getting back to the story of how the Bank of North Dakota actually got started and got beyond that priming the pump phase. As it turns out, that contentious fight between the two parties, one of the parties lost, I think it was in 1922, to the opposing party that absolutely did not want a bank, a public bank. So it's kind of like the Republicans versus the Democrats, but the Democrats were kind of skeptical as well too, but it was still their legislation, and they were still floating the bonds. They lost out in that election. Ultimately, what happened was, at the last minute, those bonds were purchased, with the emphasis that these were bonds that were backed by great farmland in North Dakota. And so it was kind of a gift that one party gave to the next party. And with all that money in reserve now in a bank, do you think that party that came into power was going to stop it or chloroform it? No. With that money available, they decided to go all out, and they did. And so that was the rocky road at the beginning of the Bank of North Dakota. There's the video I'll show you in a second or two. Goes through some of that history and some of the contentious fighting and around the bond, the floating of the bond, or the sale of the bond, and the difficulty they initially had. So, did I go too far? Okay, we talked about the. Okay, so I've kind of indicated some of the history for North Dakota. Let me bring up this is a shorter video. Oh, I'm sorry. This is in fact that video I just referred to.
They had to fight being.
So I'm not going to take you through the whole video, but I did want to introduce it to you and let you know it's available on YouTube.
As communists. And really, they're just simply farmers who wanted a fair shake.
Okay, so what I will do is jump ahead to a point that's a little more poignant. It discusses a little bit about the
and it's probably
difficulty and the contentious
crisis in the
infighting.
20s was even worse than the one in the 30s, judging on the number of banks that went under.
The economic crisis gave league opponents the opening they needed. The Independent Voters Association was well funded by out-of-state interests and determined to keep the bank from selling the bonds it needed to finance the farm loan program.
Out-of-state
The
interests.
sale of the bonds
That's
was something
code
that
for
was
Wall Street.
interesting and fascinating aspect of this whole business, because if those real estate bonds sold, it meant the bank would be in business. And so
That's capitalization.
the Independent
That's
Voters
money in reserve.
Association,
That's going to be
and the North Dakota
10% of the
Bankers
total value of the
Association,
bank going
anybody who
forward.
was opposed to the idea of a state-owned bank worked to stop the sale of those bonds. And there is a 30-month period in North Dakota history. I don't think we've ever seen the intensity, the political infighting, the struggles between people who wanted to sell the bonds and Wall Street Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, these national magazines involved in the arguments around whether North Dakota can sell those bonds.
That helped the opposition not only coalesce, but to attract additional members.
Well, it was very interesting to me that both Great Northern and the Northern Pacific pretty much gave lawyers to the opposition.
So the key word there was
Challenges
coalesce.
both at
You
the district,
really
the
need to
state,
form
and
a
the Supreme Court
coalition
level,
of like-minded
challenging the
interested
sale of the
parties.
bonds and the right of North Dakota to create a state-owned bank. The whole argument about who's going to audit and who's going to make sure that the books aren't crooked. If you think we have intimidation today, this is nothing compared to what was going on in 1919 and 1920.
People in this state are generally pretty skeptical about government anyhow. And here they were kind of going out on a limb, putting faith in these political leaders that they would bring about a political revolution that would help their local economy. But the minute that political revolution looked like it might be tainted with corruption or tainted with special favoritism for certain individuals in the state, that just fed back into the natural cynicism that seems to be characteristic of an independent farmer. So the minute that the league was tainted, whether they were acting politically or were acting economically, I guess doesn't matter now, because the public decided that they were acting politically.
In 1921, with the bank rocked by allegations of favoritism and mismanagement, North Dakota became the first state in the nation to recall an elected official from office. And it recalled not just one, but the entire Industrial Commission. Voters removed the NPL governor, Attorney General, and Agriculture Commissioner from office and replaced them with IVA-endorsed candidates. The Bank of North Dakota was now in the hands of its greatest opponent.
The bonds were sold the day before the opposition took control of the bank. And so finally, the opposition, the IVA, which was opposed to state ownership, which was opposed to the Bank of North Dakota, all of a sudden hit $12.3 million. And I think that's really the irony of the Bank of North Dakota.
Remember, this
the
is
bank
1921
only
we're
became
talking about.
successful once the opponents of the bank took control of it.
Okay, so please feel free to go to YouTube, take a look at the history there. It's fascinating, Bank of North Dakota. But point being, the Bank of North Dakota, as Gus and Ken in the video just prior to this were alluding to, is not necessarily a retail bank, and they're not looking to compete with retail bankers. For example, today you've got great retail banks with Bank of America, Chase, TD Bank, you name it. Just go up and down Post Avenue, or go up and down Greenwich Avenue, or wherever Main Street there is for you, and you'll see probably a handful of banks. These are all great retail banks. Anybody that services the public is not the type of bank that's going to be in competition with a state bank. State banks are all about loan participation, so they'll jump into other sorts of larger projects that require loan participation to, let's say, reduce interest, to actually make a project possible. Imagine the Bay Bridge. If there was loan participation in that from a California state bank, and instead of 6% on average interest over that 20-odd year period or 30-odd year period that they floated those general obligation bonds, or those muni bonds, or those state backed bonds, imagine 2% or 1%. And imagine that compounding effect would have on the total cost of it. So instead of that project, in fact, doubling, costing 100% in interest, let's say it only cost 25% in interest. So the other 75% in interest you could use that would have been spent with private banking through a state, California state, in the case of the Bay Bridge. It could be here in Connecticut. Think of your favorite project that you would like to see, maybe downtown Bridgeport, revitalized. You know, any vacant building nearby, wherever it is that you live. Think if that were transformed into anything from a factory, manufacturing facility, to a community organizational gathering spot, to a restaurant, to anything other than simply laying there fallow, not producing anything, and not paying taxes. Okay, so not to dwell too much on the Bank of North Dakota, but that is the poster child at this point for what public banking could do or could be in
In some ways, the Bank of North Dakota is an
flavor.
example.
Let me jump ahead. Okay, I want to point out some of the key facts. Some of these I've already touched on. 10 key facts here I'm listing, and these, by the way, I took from the great Public Banking Institute's website. You could see them there as well for yourself, but I thought I'd introduce them to you in the presentation here. So number one is they serve as the depository for local government funds. Doesn't have to be a state bank, but that's what I'm advocating. Look, as far as I'm concerned, let's start with the biggest thing we can. Because from there, if everybody sees this big thing succeeding and succeeding so well, I don't have a problem with other smaller municipalities, counties, municipalities, cities, heck, even organizations, religious organizations, school organizations. You know, wouldn't it be great if Yale University had its own public state bank? But it is a private university. Keep that in mind. So you would deposit all your taxes, all your fees, everything into that bank instead of sending it to the secretary or the treasury, treasury, who then kind of wraps it all up in a nice little gift package and then delivers it to Wall Street. They're required to benefit the public by serving local community needs. So the state of Connecticut is truly Connecticut first. So the money that they would have in the bank would go to betterment and usage within the state of Connecticut first, before anything else. And that obviously is not followed by Wall Street. Actually, it's not followed by Connecticut at this point, let me point out. We're investing in all kinds of out-of-state projects, out-of-state banks, out-of-country, international. Bank of Bilbao in Spain and Portugal. Actually, we're invested in that. What are we doing investing in Portugal or in Spain when we could be using or investing that same money here? Doesn't it make more sense? See, the roads, the bridges, the houses, the factories, the education that's paid for with this money is tangible to us here. That's what it means to have community benefit, as opposed to sending it to a third-party financier, Wall Street, and not knowing what projects it is investing in, or what ultimately is created with those projects, if those projects have anything to do with the state of Connecticut. Again, that's this notion of local, serving local community needs. We can save state and local government millions and even billions of dollars by cutting out the middlemen and private shareholders, eliminating fees, financing projects at lower interest rates. I think these are all fairly straightforward based on what you've heard so far. Reinvest bank profits into the community. And just as Scott mentioned, the Bank of North Dakota over the last 20 years has returned to the Treasury coffers. So has taken money that was excess or profit and put it back into the state treasury coffers in the amount of over $500 million in the last 20 years. When was the last time you ever heard the state of Connecticut sending you a check for your taxes at the end of the year? They're not run by politicians, first of all. I want to put that in. They're run by qualified bankers serving a public mission. So it's not as though you have some unqualified person heading the bank not knowing what they're doing. They provide accountability and transparency to the public for full bank decisions. Obviously, they avoid the risks of Wall Street speculative gambling. Truth be told, if you look at some of the leverage that's used on Wall Street, 20, 25, 30, 35, 38. What was John Corzine caught dealing with? Italian bonds? What was that, 38%? 38 times leverage he'd used. He was caught in a pickle. I have no idea how it got out of it. But that's the point. Such speculative gambling, which is leverage, code for leverage, simply wouldn't be allowed. It would be strictly forbidden. And of course, that goes back to the law that would institute the public bank in the state. And as I've said, I've already outlined A to Z complete legislation that would get us a public bank, very good public bank too. It was based on ideas taken from Massachusetts, North Dakota, Vermont, California, and Oregon. And I combined many of those ideas to try to come up with the best type of structure, the best type of banking system for the state of Connecticut. It would create new jobs and spur economic growth by supporting local small businesses. Again, it gets back to this notion of local. Accountability, local, community. You see the theme here? Public banking is about you. Increasing your standard of living. How does it do that? It makes absolutely sure the projects it invests money in are in your community. And those include factories, those include small businesses, those include students who want to go to school. Maybe it's an expensive school, maybe it's a Yale. This gives them the opportunity to be able to go to a Yale and become the next great Nobel laureate in, who knows, chemistry or medicine. This is what your money tangibly would be seen to do. Can you say that it's the same thing right now with the present structure that we have with Wall Street? I don't think so. We partner with and support rather than compete with local community banks. And again, retail end, we wouldn't change a thing. We don't have to. Some of the retail banks do a great job. I wouldn't want to supplant or disintermediate them. We're talking about a bank of banks, but it's a public bank of banks. So we have much more influence on other banks as well too. Can lend during times of stress and crisis, helping to sustain a healthy local economy. Let me point out the Bank of North Dakota. I keep going back to that. That's one of our, as I said, a poster child. And it's one of the great banks that we have, that's a modern bank that we have that demonstrates the effectiveness. Actually, the Bank of North Dakota, if memory serves, is ranked higher in terms of bank certification than JP Morgan. This was 2 years ago. I don't know if you saw it in the news. The bank, let me say it again, the Bank of North Dakota has a higher credit rating than JP Morgan Chase as of 2 years ago. How does the bank get that way? Well, it's well managed, it's well funded, well capitalized, and it does a great job. It's the only bank that over the last 20 years has not seen 1 year. There was 1 year which was flat, but has not seen 1 year in the red. I don't know if you can say that about any other bank because we know 2008 happened. And every single one of those bulge bracket Wall Street firms, some 14 or 15 of them, were all circled around a table with Hank Paulson, who called the shots and basically saved their heinies. Okay, so those are some of the interesting facts. I mentioned to you earlier when Doug introduced me that, or just after Doug had introduced me, that I'd be inviting Victoria Grant. Why would I want to invite a 12-year-old to a presentation about public banking? Here's why. What does she know that we don't? Because she seems to know a lot. Now, I was actually at this meeting. I am a co-coordinator for public banking in the state of Connecticut. Have been since roughly 2011. And I had actually attended this particular conference, and she spoke there too. And you will also have an opportunity to hear her and what she said, because fortunately for us, we've got YouTube, and she has put her video out on YouTube. Actually, I think it was the Public Banking Institute that put her video out there with her permission. Looks like the sound is pretty good.
It was about 5 or 6 weeks ago that Victoria spoke to a group of 600 people at a Rotary Club, and she's going to be giving the same speech to us today. And I saw it, I think a week or so after it hit the web, it started going around, and so I quickly got on the phone and talked with her dad, Zane, and invited them here. And so we have a very special treat. So Victoria, come on up, do your thing.
Have you ever wondered why Canada is in debt? Have you ever wondered why the government forces Canadians to pay so many taxes?
Quick footnote, just replace the United States
from
with
the largest
Canada in her
private
speech.
banks are
Completely
becoming
relevant.
wealthier and the rest of us are not? Have you ever wondered why the gross national debt is over $800 billion? Or why we are spending
$21.5 trillion right now in
$160
counting.
million a day on the interest of the national debt? That's $60 billion a year. Have you ever wondered who receives the $60 billion? What I have discovered is the banks and the government have colluded to financially enslave the people of Canada. I will share with you 3 important points of reference, which will hopefully spark enough interest and concern for you to continue the research on your own and to engage your government to stop this criminal act against the people of Canada.
She has memorized
First, we will
this
briefly
whole
examine the Bank
thing.
of
She's not
Canada.
reading
Second, we will
cue
see how our
cards.
banking system works today. And lastly, I will offer a viable solution that we can petition our government to implement. A very little known figure in Canadian history is Gerald Grattan McGeer. He was a lawyer, member of Parliament, and mayor of Vancouver. His contribution to Canada is probably the greatest in our history. He championed the creation of the National Bank of Canada, whose sole purpose is to create and manage Canada's money. It was formed on July 3, 1934, and owned by all Canadians. Until the 1970s, because of the Bank of Canada, Canada's national debt was held at a constant, manageable level. until the government decided to implement what we now have as our modern-day banking system that is robbing the Canadian people. So how are they robbing us? Allow me to explain how our private banks and government work today. First, the Canadian government borrows money from the private banks. They then lend the debt-based money to Canada with compounded interest. The government then continues to increase taxation of Canadians year after year in order to pay back the interest on the exponentially growing national debt. What results is inflation, less real money for Canadians to spend into our economy, and the real money being used to pad the pockets of the banks. Also, the government gave the banks the ability to loan out money that doesn't exist in the form of loans. When a bank gives you a mortgage, which literally means a death pledge or a loan, they don't actually give you money. They click a key on a computer and generate the fake money out of thin air. They don't actually have it in their bank vaults. Presently, the banks only have $4 billion on reserve, but they have loaned out over $1.5 trillion.
$4 billion
To quote Graham
to
Towers, each and every time a
trillion.
bank makes a loan, a new bank credit is created. New deposits, brand new money. Broadly speaking, all new money comes out of a bank in the form of loans. As loans are debt, then under the present system, all money is debt. What I find interesting is even Jesus, in Matthew 21, drove out the money changers in the temple because they were manipulating the currency to steal money from the people. The private banks are just like the money changers in Matthew 21. They are defrauding and robbing the people of Canada, thus their freedom, and they need to be stopped. How should the banking system work? In an infamous interview, Mr. McGeer asked Mr. Towers, "Can you tell me why a government with power to create money should give that power away to a private monopoly and then borrow that which Parliament can create itself back at interest to the point of national bankruptcy?" Mr. Towers replied, "If Parliament wants to change the form of operating the banking system, then certainly that is within the powers of Parliament. In other words, if the Canadian government needs money, they can borrow it directly from the Bank of Canada. The people would then pay fair taxes to repay the Bank of Canada. This tax money would in turn get injected back into our economic infrastructure and the debt would be wiped out. Canadians would again prosper with real money as the foundation of our economic structure and not debt money. Regarding the debt money owed to the private banks, such as the Royal Bank, we would simply have the Bank of Canada print the money owing, hand it over to the private banks, and then clear the debt with the Bank of Canada. And yes, we have the power and lawful right to do so. In conclusion, it has become painfully obvious, even for me, a 12-year-old Canadian, that we are being defrauded and robbed by the banking system and a complicit government. What will we do to stop this crime? What will we do to ensure that the next generation will live free and clear of the debt-based economy that enslaves them to the banks? Margaret Mead said the following, and I hope that all of you remember this. "Never doubt that a small group of people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." Thank you.
So I think you'll agree she's very articulate and probably summarizes the whole public banking solution, which she outlined very clearly to not just Canada, but to the U.S.'s issues or problems. As she kind of indicated, Canada has the right shoe on the left foot and the left shoe on the right foot. And don't we as well? Shouldn't the Treasury be the public bank of the United States and the Fed be that private bank that we give the money to? Isn't that the way it should be? It's just the opposite now, isn't it? That's what she outlined.
What happened to the national banks? Because we used to have national banks in the 19th century, didn't we?
They did. In the case of Canada, I believe it was the legislation that changed it.
Didn't we have the National Bank under Alexander Hamilton?
We did. That was the first state bank of the United States, and actually the second he implemented. I'm sorry, that was the second. And guess who killed that? Andrew Jackson, absolutely correct. 1832. And Biddle, one of the Wall Street moguls, he caused him to pay a lot of grief for that, a lot of grief. There was a depression that followed in 33, 34, and 35, if I'm not mistaken, in the United States. Jackson held steady, just like the true warrior that he was. And we got out of the Depression just fine. And we had currency issued once again by the United States at that point. So, let me also mention this. Do you realize that 40% of the banking that goes on around the world is actually public banking? And aside from the state of North Dakota, most of that banking exists outside of the United States. For example, in Germany, which I know well, I handled partly in Deutschland, they actually, the post bank, when you go into the post office, that's a public bank. And you could do not just your banking, but your postage, any sort of postal needs that you have, sending packages, receiving packages, etc. Same way in Japan too. Same way in India as well. In China, public banks are funding massive infrastructure projects, and if you haven't seen some of them, they're quite staggering, jaw-dropping. Three Gorges Dam, for example. It makes the Hoover Dam look very small. And just take a look. All this is available through YouTube and through Google Internet searches or your favorite search engine. In China and India, they collectively make up 40% of the global population itself, right? Where you've got about 1 billion, 1.2 billion, let's call it 2.3 total billion, out of a 7 billion base, maybe 7.5 by now. And 70 to 80% of their banking is publicly done. It's publicly owned. Obviously, China's economy was on a tear over the last 10 to 15 years. And you would have to credit some of that to their banking system. And of course, some of it to perhaps our lax trade practices, but we'll see what happens going forward. Canada, and you just heard from a great young spokeslady, Victoria Grant, on the Canadian situation. Publicly owned Alberta Treasury branches that connect nearly every town in their shared credit system. And that existed from 1935 to 1974. We talked about the state-owned Bank of Canada, which made direct loans to the government funding infrastructure and the work. So apparently in 74 is when the legislation might have been implemented that changed that in Canada. So if I were to click on this. Now the reason I do this is to have you and refer you back to the Public Banking Institute. It's not the only website out there. It's one of the better collections of information about public banking though. And it's sort of a nexus for those who are advocates of public banking and are working towards public banking in many states. Here you'll find a specific web page on that Public Banking Institute called Around the World, and it kind of goes through some of what I just covered with you there. Okay, so if you want to learn more, and this is what Wall Street doesn't want you to know, I would suggest taking a look, whoops, taking a look at Web of Debt. Now I told you about Ellen Brown, or I mentioned her name earlier. Ellen Brown is considered the matriarch of public banking as a solution and the whole public banking approach in modern times in the U.S. Let me point out, as for example, going back to that first video I had shown you with Ken and Gus, public banking was an integral part of the formation of this country through the Bank of Philadelphia, through colonial public banks that existed. and some of that they covered. So there is a long history that goes back many, many years. But the fact or sad fact of the matter is, it's beyond the reaches of most of our memories, because in our present lifetime, we are not as familiar with public banks being established and being used in the United States regularly. They seem to have gone out of disfavor with some of the private banks, and that may be because private banks were just better at advertising, marketing, and getting clientele to bring their money to them. So I want you to take a look at Ellen Brown's website, for example, what Wall Street doesn't want you to know. And specifically, one Wall Street scandal after another delusions all of us with respect to the banking system. However, the sad fact of the matter is, or the truth of the matter is, we can't conduct modern life in communities without some sort of a banking glue to hold us all together. So all money today is simply bank credit, or debt generated, as Victoria Grant referred to it. So economies run on it, and and it's created when banks make loans. How did you like the notion that when you go into a bank for a mortgage, as she put it, or a loan, and you want to buy that nice house, and the bank says, okay, you're going to have to put some money down, and by the way, that 20% you put down, do you think that's more than enough to cover their reserve to be able to loan out 10 times that? So they've already paid themselves back, and some, handsomely, at that point, when they've asked you for any money down, 20% down, whatever. And then the rest of it is all basically icing on the cake for them. So you walk in there, and you're going to ask for a 15, 20, 30-year mortgage. You know what you've just done? You have traded your labor for them to click a keyboard. That's what you've done. 30 years of your life, you have just exchanged in that singular moment with a click for someone's finger to click a button on a keyboard now, because that's where money is now. Money is no longer backed by any tangible asset. No, remember, it's the good faith of the United States government, good faith and goodwill of the United States government. Basically, that's what backs money. And that last change was done in 1971 by Richard Nixon when he closed the gold window. When Britain came to the Treasury saying, we've got $1.6 billion that we would like converted into gold. And your bills say they're convertible. I'll take that shipment straight away. We've got a ship here that'll take it to our London Tower. Richard said no. I'm sorry. The window's closed today and forever. Goodbye. Okay, so what's left with respect to public banking and you? Here's what's left. What I'd like you to do, it's really your public bank as a Connectizen, a citizen of the state of Connecticut. It's ultimately in your best interest. Hopefully they, some of the speakers I had on and some of the material I pointed you to has demonstrated well that it's in your best interest to have a public bank in the state of Connecticut. I'll refer to it as the Connecticut State Bank. That may not be the only public bank that you might want to have. You might want to consider one for your religious organization, or your community organization, or your city, or your county, or a particular club that you have that's pretty big, that you would want some sort of banking and the ability to use fractional reserve banking, make loans, and connect up with the other banks in the system. So 3 things you can do in terms of getting involved immediately. Support local initiatives. I'm very happy and excited to be here to talk to you about public banking this evening, and I'm excited that you're interested in learning more about public banking. So you've already taken the first step in terms of participation. Yeah, events like this, or events that discuss and make you aware, help you understand what public banking is and what it's not. It's not private banking. And what private banking is and what it's not. It's private banking, it's not public banking. National conferences, since 2012, we've had annual national conferences They've been in different locations. The first inaugural was actually in Philadelphia in 2012. And that was the conference at which Victoria Grant spoke as well too. I was there. They've had it in other places like San Rafael, Santa Fe, New Mexico, Oregon. So throughout the United States, there is interest and strong interest in many areas. California has very strong interest, especially in Southern California. The weekly newsletter. Oh, by the way, well, look at the governor over here in New Jersey who took a stand for public banking as well too. Who knows? Maybe New Jersey will institute a New Jersey state bank as well. Weekly newsletters. You can actually subscribe to those when you go to the publicbankinginstitute.org website. Just fill in your email, your name, and they'll shoot you a newsletter, an email with a newsletter attached to it every week. Keep you up to date. They also have weekly meetings, and oftentimes I attend those. These are conference calls. When I say weekly meetings, I mean to say weekly conference calls for public banking. So with that said, I will take any questions. Now, I also want to point out, if I'll take questions and answers. But if there's something that comes to mind between after today's presentation and whenever it comes to your mind, I want you to go to the Public Banking Institute. They actually have a FAQ in the format of questions and answers as well. So maybe you'll find your question in there, but if not, you may find someone else's question interesting and want to read that as well too.
You have a video of Ellen Brown?
You know what? I did promise that she would be here this evening, but only in the sense of a blog. There are a lot of videos with Ellen Brown in there. Here, I'll take you back to the website. And that's a website I would suggest just clicking around. You'll find so much interesting. She has her blog, and Ellen actually sends out a weekly email blog. I get that from Ellen as well too. You click on any one of these hyperlinked words or phrases, and they'll take you to something interesting. Let me point out, where are her videos on her site? Right over here. Go to videos. And I suppose if you want, what the heck, let's just take a look at her latest.
We're getting close to 9 o'clock.
Okay. Listen, I guess that's all I'm slated for. Any questions that I can answer? I think you had your hand up. I'll get to you. Just yeah.
Okay. I do personal banking with Savings Bank of Danbury, Union Savings Bank, People's Bank, and Sikorsky Federal Credit Union. I want to go out there tomorrow, and I want to make whatever changes you think might be appropriate. What would you recommend that I do?
Okay. You have a short-term improvements. When you ask, what should I do for short-term improvements? What, do you mean to say, do you want to have better yields on your?
I want to do what's right by people, and I absolutely am in favor of the state banking. I've been for a long time. Thank you for being.
Well, I appreciate that.
Reinforcing my.
I appreciate your interest and your appreciation for state banks.
But short term.
I'm not suggesting you take any money out of those, especially Sikorsky has a very good track record from what I understand. I don't know if you're a Sikorsky employee or otherwise.
I need to put $50 in a savings account in order to do the checking account.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I'm not suggesting you take money out of any of those banks that you've mentioned. A couple of them sound local. That's partly why too.
Well, how about if I had some money in Bank of America? What should I do? Take it out of Bank of America and invest it in local banks in the interim until we have a state bank?
That's an interesting thought. You might want to think about investing more locally. Yeah, just think about investing more locally. And if it's going to be a bank, look at the, you talked about Danbury, you talked about Sikorsky. These are great local banks. And I know that they invest in projects and infrastructure locally, for the most part. So if you're looking to contribute to the community, through your fund, vicariously, or in as much a in a passive, hands-off or passive manner as possible, maybe something like a reallocation of that money to the local banks is something you might want to consider.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not saying Bank of America is bad. Bank of America does some great stuff.
You mentioned it for more like commercial loans.
Yes.
Okay, but not for our own personal.
Retail banking.
Okay, our own personal money.
Yeah, that would be retail. You and I are, when we use our ATM, that's part of the retail banking system.
I'm a realtor and I tell people don't go to Bank of America, Wells Fargo. Go for your mortgages locally.
That's good advice. I'm a broker too.
Of course, the problem is I had a loan from a local bank and they sold my loan. I mean,
yes,
just like a big bank, you know.
That's one of the things many of the banks do, especially the larger banks. They bundle them because they have the capacity to send that loan, get together a bunch of loans that they took locally through their retail front ends, to send them down to their Bank of America Wall Street desks for MBSs, CMBSs, so mortgage-backed securities or commercial mortgage-backed securities, CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, and it gets funkier than that in terms of the derivative world, like CDO squares, so CDOs of CDOs. So collateralized debt obligations of collateralized debt obligations.
The ratings agencies say they're all at AAA rated, and then we end up
well,
with a crash.
They tranche them. Here's what they do. They end up taking everything in, and kind of like milk. You'll notice in the production of milk, usually the cream goes to the top. Well, that's kind of what happens. That's kind of what they hope happens. When they actually create these and package these products, CDO squares especially, those are, and some of the math behind it, frankly, is a little bit questionable. But they've done their statistical analysis, they believe what they're, or the salespeople believe what they want to believe, and say to the potential clients or customers what they want to hear potentially. Anyways, long story short, so in the analogy with production of milk, cream goes to the top, they cut that tranche off and they say, okay, this is AAA. This is the cream of the milk product. Then you got your whole milk, your 2%, your skim, and then your water. So in analogy, so yeah, they tranche it up 4, 5, sometimes different tranches, and they sell off the different tranches as having different credit rating and credit worthiness associated with them. But it all came from the same original pool. All came from the same.
Right, but why should I invest in a local bank if they're just going to sell my loan?
You raise a good point, and I said that at the very beginning. Many of the boldest bracket banks do that because what they do is they package them, then they sell off these packaged products to someone else. When they sell that off, somebody else owns that, and usually has loan servicing companies handle it, or loan servicing companies are already in the mix, and it has nothing more to do with that sweet guy or gal that you spoke to, whom you showed your life to be able to get that loan, and that loan is long gone from them, and they don't service it. It's packaged, it goes to a loan servicer, and then that packaged product is sold to oftentimes another bank. Oftentimes it ends up in small community banks around the country because they are, I'm not going to say hoodwinked, but they're more gullible, shall we say. Anyways, yes?
Considering the importance of the banking industry and the control the banking industry has in the state of Connecticut, what do you think you're going to be able to do in the state of Connecticut to bring a state bank into the state, into being? It sounds like you're at the very edge of the water. As far as I'm concerned, it's never going to happen.
Well, remember the Revolutionary War.
I don't have any money in any banks in Connecticut. And my investments are done with my son in New York.
Okay. I do a lot of business there too. Remember, the Revolutionary War was fought by less than 5% of the colonial population. So if you're asking me, what am I going to do? I'll do everything I can to institute a Connecticut state.
Probability that anything will happen. What is the probability? I don't see any probability we're getting a state bank.
Let me cut to the chase and ask you, what happened when you presented this bill up in the state legislature?
We were thanked and summarily not asked any questions. We were escorted out under kind circumstances, and that was just about the end of it. Now, this was back in 2014. Mike, that was 2014 or 15? Yeah.
We're told, thank you very much, have a good day.
Yeah. So,
but things may change. I think that things are changing. You have more and more truly progressive candidates running and winning their seats. And this state bank is one of the platforms. We were supporting David Michelle in Stanford. He won, he beat the incumbent Democrat 68-32. And when he goes to Hartford, he'll push this. And there's other very progressive candidates across the state who are running who will win. And it may not happen soon, but I have a feeling this is coming.
You have to take it soon. You have to take the first step.
Hey, all right, we're 7 minutes over time here, so
not a problem. Just a follow-up comment. What are you going to do, young lady? What are you going to do if there's a both of you? What are you going to do if there's a monetary collapse?
Is it who?
Monetary collapse.
We had one in 2008.
We just about had
I
one.
lost everything. I had 50% of everything I had invested in all my life.
By the way, as of March 20th of 2014, guess what? The next major crisis we have, all your money in the bank belongs to the bank. You're not getting it back.
Bail-ins, not bail-outs.
Yep, these are called bail-ins. It was voted by the EU and accepted by, as I understand it, accepted by the United States as practice. And I understood it to be some sort of a presidential executive order.
So if there's another crash, they can dip into deposits to make themselves
You get
whole.
bailed in, my friend, and you get issued shares of that bank for whatever it's worth.
In return for your deposits.
Yes. And no, you can't go to the bank and you can't get the money. They'll give you that equity share certificate.
Isn't that what happened in Cyprus?
That did happen in Cyprus, absolutely correct. And as a result of that, this banking act was enacted in the European Union, as well as accepted apparently by the United States banking system as well. Not at that point.
All right, Ed, we could probably have you back another time and ask for more questions. So thanks a lot. There's lots to think about.